We're always told that history is just random, one chaotic thing after another. But what if that's not the whole story? What if history is more like a program, a code, written by someone with a very specific structure, and maybe a few glitches? Well, today, we're hacking into that code. So let's get started. We're going to decompile the source code of the English monarchy. And look, we're not here for the usual stories you read in a textbook. No, we're digging for something else. Patterns, weird anomalies, repeating bits of code that just shouldn't be there in a supposedly random timeline. We're hunting for bugs in the official narrative. Okay, so our first exploit, it's actually a really simple one, a numerical pattern that's been hiding in plain sight this whole time. Think of it like a strange loop in the code that just keeps running for centuries, a real ghost in the machine. All right, take a look at this. This is the official list, right? The accepted sequence of English kings from 899 all the way to 1483. And yeah, it looks pretty normal. Just a long line of power struggles, wars, successions. All this stuff we're told is the bedrock of history. You could say this is the program's official output.
But here's the thing. Just because the output looks clean doesn't mean the code behind it is. So let's run a quick diagnostic, a simple search function. We're just going to look for one repeating variable in this whole supposedly random sequence.
And that variable? It's the number 7. That's it, just a simple number. But watch what happens when we run it against the list. We'll start right at the top with the first king on our list, Edward the Elder, and we're just going to count forward by 7.
And there it is. You see it? Starting with Edward the Elder back in 899, every single 7th king is named Edward. Edward the Martyr, Edward the Confessor, then Edward the First, Second, Third, and Fourth. It's a perfect, unbroken loop, a 7-step cycle that just executes flawlessly for almost 600 years. Wow. I mean, you gotta ask, right? What are the odds of that happening by chance? Real history, with all its chaos and violence and unpredictability, it just doesn't produce code this clean, this predictable. This kind of pattern doesn't scream random chance. It suggests a compiler, a deliberate, intentional structure.
All right, let's keep going and see how deep this rabbit hole goes. If we zoom out from just that one repeating variable, we start to see evidence that the entire architecture of these dynasties might be, well, artificially structured. So just look at how these dynasties are organized. They don't just messily bleed into one another like you'd expect. Instead, they fall into these weirdly neat blocks. You've got a block of 8 kings, 4 Danish, 4 Anglo-Saxon. Then a clean block of 4 Norman kings. Then another block of 8 Anjou-Plantagenet kings. And later on, you get 3 neat little blocks of 3. It's just too organized. It feels less like actual history and a lot more like a well-commented section of code.
Okay, and this is where things get really interesting. So if the architecture itself is structured, what about the actual functions inside the code? Well, this is where we find something that looks, for all the world, like a classic copy-paste job, a repeating subroutine in the history program.
Let's analyze this one function call. You have the first king named Henry. He's a Norman king, and he ruled for exactly 35 years. Got it? Okay. Now the very next king named Henry, this time an Anjou-Plantagenet, he also ruled for, you guessed it, exactly 35 years, the exact same reign length. Is that just a bizarre coincidence, or is this just recycled code?
And it's not a one-off. The program runs again, but this time on a bigger scale. Check this out. The combined reigns of the 3 Lancaster Henrys, Henry IV, V, and VI, add up to 62 years. Then, a little while later, the first 2 Tudor Henrys come along, and their combined reigns also exactly 62 years. It's the same function, just executed twice. What this really looks like is some kind of nested algorithm. Seriously, the sequence of names between King John way back in 1199 and Queen Jane in 1553, it's not random at all. It's this structured composition, Henrys, Edwards, Richards, almost like a formula being solved over hundreds of years. That is not the signature of random chance. Okay, so let's recap. We've got bugs, we've got loops, we've got copied and pasted code. All of these glitches, they seem to be pointing towards a much bigger and honestly a much more radical theory, that huge sections of our historical operating system weren't just a little buggy, they might have been written much, much later than we've been led to believe.
And this idea isn't new. It leads us to a really crucial point, first proposed by a 19th century researcher named Edwin Johnson.
He argued that the problem wasn't just a few bad lines of code. No, he said the entire medieval period might be what he called a phantom history. Basically, a giant fabrication.
Think of it in coding terms. Imagine a huge 700-year block of commented out code right in the middle of the timeline. Just empty space. Then, centuries later, maybe around the 16th century, programmers, or in this case chroniclers, went back and filled in that blank space. They populated it with made-up stories, fictitious kings, and fabricated events, all to create a timeline that looks seamless, but is actually completely artificial.
And maybe the best piece of evidence for this phantom era is a feature that just kept failing to compile, and that's the name Arthur. So the legendary King Arthur, right? He supposedly lived way back in the 5th century. But then, for almost 1,000 years, the name Arthur is completely gone. It's absent from every royal house, a whole millennium gap. And then, all of a sudden, in 1486, the Tudors show up and try to install an Arthur II.
But the variable just wouldn't stick. The program kept crashing every single time. Arthur Tudor, he died at 15. Then you have 2 Scottish princes named Arthur who came later. Both died in infancy. It's almost as if the historical operating system literally had no place for this name. It just rejected it every time it was introduced. The legendary name it never took root in reality.
So, where does that leave us? What do all these bugs, these unnatural loops, this phantom data, what does it all tell us about the program we call history? What did we actually find by hacking the source code?
Well, we found that repeating function, the Edward loop. We saw those unnatural architectural blocks that make up the dynasties. We found what looks like recycled code with the identical reigns of kings named Henry. And we found that critical variable, Arthur, that just kept failing to compile. You put it all together, and these look like the signatures of an artificial construction, not a messy, organic history.
And that leaves us with one final and pretty unsettling question. Because look, this isn't really about dusty old kings from centuries ago. This is about the integrity of the entire system. If the source code of our own past is this corrupted, if it can be written and then rewritten, then you have to start questioning the very nature of the program that we are all running right here, right now.